I am so looking forward to having the chance to speak with you, Ian, because I know just a little bit about what you do. So I was going to ask you to start by just explaining more about what you do to get a fuller picture of it.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having me on your program. I do a couple of things. I think like most people, I have a portfolio career. I'm sure you do as well. I would say the two main activities are I'm an executive coach, or what I like to kind of set it up by saying strategic advisor. So I work with executives to level up their skill sets when they've just done promotion or hoping to promote themselves within the company, or in some cases, I work with founders who are starting tech startups and other things, and looking to add to their leadership toolkit as they're stepping up into a new level of excellence. And then the second thing I do is I write a newsletter called E-Intelligence, where I think you've maybe come across some of my work, where I write about two things really: AI and neuroscience, and how those two things can help us become the best versions of ourselves, professionally as well as personally.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I come from a quite a traditional learning and development background. So I focused my career to this point on mainly on developing workshops and courses for the workplace, though, sort of in a corporate context. But I was curious to learn more from you because you come at performance from a different perspective. So I sort of come from the more traditional learning and development side, and you're coming at it as a coach, but focused on enhancing performance in the workplace. So I think that's a really great perspective for me to learn from. Um, so if I can ask you from your perspective then, what are the knowledge and skills and attitudes that you think people need to be successful in the workplace over the next 5 to 10 years?
So thank you for kind of teeing that up with me in the email exchange that we had. So I took it quite literally, and I kind of came up with a bunch of skills, a bunch of approaches, and a bunch of attitudes that I'd like to share with your audience. So the first thing I would preface our conversation by saying I used to call these skills future-proof skills, because I had this conceit that we could, kind of bulletproof ourselves against the future. And kind of modeling some of the behavior that I'll be talking about in a second, I've eaten some humble pie. And so now I call them future ready skills. So we are, ready for the future rather as opposed to being proofed against the future. And the skills I'll kind of focus on, there's two what I would call meta skills, and there's three that I think are particularly salient in the AI age that we've entered into. So the two meta skills, one is probably not that surprising to you, but I think incredibly important. It's what I call reinvention skills or adaptation skills. And this is true whether you work in a corporate environment and you're an employee, or you're a solopreneur like myself and are looking to, succeed as an individual contributor or as a company of one. The reinvention skills are really a bouquet of skills within their own kind of right. So, just to kind of tick through some of the ones that I would call adaptation or reinvention skills. One is kind of being professionally supple. So, thinking of yourself as kind of a yogi in the professional sense and not getting too rigid in any one career or any one approach. Another one is to have the courage and conviction to make pivots, so strategic pivots, as I call them, and to be very afraid of staying stagnant. Whether it's again in your role, if you're not learning anything new in your role, that should be a yellow flag and not a red flag. And for me, those are the kind of telltale signs that things are getting a little kind of the waters are running still as opposed to running with a current. The third thing I would say about reinvention skills is that you want to, whether you would like to or not, you have to build up a bit of a personal brand. So something that you're known for in the larger milieu. And, as you've done, Sarah, with this wonderful podcast and some of the other things you're doing, you're investing in building up a platform. And I think we all have to do that. And that's true, again, for people who work within an organization. So you have an internal platform where you're known in your organization as the AI guy or AI gal, or someone who has particular interest in something. And of course, as an individual contributor outside, your personal brand is a lot. It is, tremendously important, if not mission critical. And I guess the fourth thing I would say about, of course, reinvention skills, a subset, is to invest in what I call your network capital. It's kind of a fancy way of describing your set of friends, professional peers, and acquaintances that will allow you to do all the things that I just discussed. So, kind of learning, building up your brand, making strategic pivots, all of these things are made possible and are enabled by having a broad professional network or network capital. And, in my work as a coach, but also in the occasional workshop that I give, I talk about, this idea of network capitalism as something that you invest in like a venture capitalist would rather than as a transactional used car salesman might. So not thinking about transactions, thinking about building those relationships, and not exactly sure where or how those will kind of be beneficial. Much the same way that venture capitalists invest in 10 companies and expect one to succeed, but they don't know which one. Similarly, you should approach your network of professional contacts as, relationships that you invest in, not knowing at that precise moment, and not really counting on at that precise moment, they will turn into something. But I can assure you that they will, because that's always been the case for me over the course of my long career. Maybe I'll pause for a second and let you react to those, because I'd love to get your thoughts on some of those reinvention skills that, I believe in very strongly.
Well, I feel like you're speaking directly to me right now. Because until I think last year, or at least let's say the last 6 months, I thought I would be able to outrun the ripples of AI in my career. And I thought, well, I wasn't really sure I was ever going to be able to retire, but I thought somehow I was going to be able to continue doing what I'm doing and stay ahead of it. And I have come to a full realization that I cannot do that. And so the need to pivot, I think the networking part, and I think maybe you and I have had a similar trajectory of career, but like I'm 25 plus years of connecting with people and making connections and trying to learn and establish new opportunities, and hopefully not come at it from a transactional, but from like a truly curious and interested perspective to see where things could go. But the pivot part, when I realized what was happening, suddenly seemed really challenging to me, because I thought, it's a big pivot for me. It's not just sort of like moving within the domain that I understood my profession to be. My profession has completely changed. And what I do today, I will not be doing. I want to say like in 2 months from now, in 3 months, I don't really know. But everything I've done and my sense of my personal brand is kind of poof. And I was pretty unsettled by that for quite some time. And so even this opportunity to talk with people, coming from a really personal place for me, because I'm trying to learn what skills from both perspectives, what skills I need, and is there a place for me to help people continue to develop skills the way I have in the past, but from a different angle somehow, because AI, not long from now, will be capable of doing exactly the work as I traditionally conceive it. It'll do it well enough.
Man, I feel the same way. First of all, congratulations, A, on having this realization, B, on acting on it. Not everybody have either the insight to see that, things are changing around them, and, have the gumption and courage really to go into a different direction, particularly as you and I are, I think, contemporaries, to having done so after 20 or 30 years invested in a archetypal career. Mine has not been as archetypal perhaps as yours. I've been kind of what I call intentionally eclectic. But for most people at our ages, it's really hard to pivot because, hey, I've got all this kind of sunk cost invested in, kind of the way I did it and how I did it. So that's really important. And it kind of is a nice segue to another set of skills that I think are really important to your listeners. I would say it's a pair. One is, it's kind of obvious, but I think really worth emphasizing, lifelong learning. So adopting approach as you have of embracing change and learning new skills as you have. You become a podcast host. Probably not something you saw, on the bingo card a couple of years ago, and yet here you are. And something that you didn't mention, but I think probably is, I'm guessing, a little bit true with you, is lifelong unlearning. So, that you don't often hear that particular pair, but what I've realized is one of the kind of wake-up calls you have in the AI age is so much of what you knew is no longer relevant. Whether it's how you did your work, some of the actual tacit knowledge that you have is much less relevant than it used to be. And so having this kind of intellectual humility to unlearn things so that you can kind of wipe the slate clean and then have a tabula rasa, if you will, to then learn. I think that's critical. And, people always talk about lifelong learning, really important, of course. But unless you unlearn things, you're going to have a lot of problems, kind of marrying those two world views because they're in good intention. So, this has kind of knock-on effects in terms of things like mindsets, and we'll get to, I'm sure, in a second. But part of the learning and unlearning approach is to be a really critical, if not contrarian thinker. As I'm sure you've embraced in your work, you can't take assumptions for granted anymore, whether it's about your career and about your skill set. So you have to question them. Is it true? Is it still true? And is it applicable to me? Are the three questions I often ask when I come across something that is either a contention or an assumption. And so that's where I kind of really focus on when I am unlearning things. And then the last thing I would say marries both is leaning into your curiosity. So a lot of people have focused on the trepidation that we feel in the AI age, and I'm not immune from it, but I've chosen to embrace the upside potential and to be very positive about it. And I also think we've never been in a better place if you're a curious person. It's never been easier to learn so quickly and so deeply from some of the world's greatest thinkers who have been distilled into these chatbots. And I am kind of either embarrassed, but also a little sheepish to say that I nerd out with AI frequently during at night, instead of watching Netflix, as I sometimes do, I'll get into this conversation with GPT, which is my model of choice. And I'll go for like an hour and a half riffing on philosophy, as we were talking about a little offline, noodling out ideas about posts that I'm going to be writing on or concepts I want to pitch to my executive clients. And so my girlfriend kind of teased me a bit because she saw me that I was kind of in the study, kind of on my phone. And I was telling her that I was talking to ChatGPT, and she said, I think you're talking dirty with it. And I said, no, I'm not talking dirty with it. I'm talking nerdy with it. So my recommendation to everyone is, maybe don't develop those parasocial relationships with AI quite yet. Try to develop a professorial relationship where you can treat it as a peer, like almost a salon where you can discuss ideas. And it's a remarkable technology for that kind of application. Have you used it in that way, Sarah?
I for the first time, before I use it for brainstorming and kind of bouncing ideas in areas I was less familiar with, and I found it really useful. But I did just today, actually, I used it for something related directly to work. And I asked a question and it came up with some topics. And I said, could you integrate these concepts into your topics? It completely lost track of what it had done literally 5 seconds before and kind of fumbled it. And I thought, okay, not like being overly judgmental. Like it's not for me in my area of work. It's not there yet. It just can't seem to hold the line like really. And so I think it still requires some discernment. I do think sometimes when people are using it, and for me, so if I'm using it in areas I'm less familiar with, I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm learning a lot. But then I had that moment of, am I though? Because when I use it in a topic, a subject area that I'm more familiar with, I can see it doesn't have the depth yet. It doesn't have the ability to like really think I don't think to be really critical about what it's sending back to you. And if you say, oh, but you kind of dropped the ball there, it'll say, oh, aren't you so clever? Yes, you're absolutely right. Aren't you so smart that you figured that out? And then it'll fix it. But I'm like, but how did it get messed up in the first place? Now that part worries me still a little bit that we're at this point. I know it's improving at a rate that is tremendous. That's the part that I find fascinating, that it's getting so much better so fast. But right now, I have concerns about people using it to do things and it's not capable of doing well. In my view.
It's a very, very valid point. You touched upon a couple of things I'd like to pick up on because they're so important to emphasize to your listeners. One is this idea of being a skeptical consumer of AI content. So luckily you have, and we all have areas of expertise that we can lean on and say, wait a minute here, what you just spent spot back to me, ChatGPT is not quite right or not right at all. And I think that is a real advantage that people like you and I have who have, decades of experience and education that we can stand on. For the younger, more AI native and digital native generation, that are going into the workforce with maybe AI skills. Not all of them do, but all of them are much more adept at using AI. But they don't have that depth of judgment and of knowledge that we learned in our video, you in philosophy and me in political science. And, most of that knowledge is not directly applicable to our careers necessarily, although I'm sure yours is. But it does give us this depth that we can then use to interrogate the questions and answers that we get back from AI. And I think that's really a skill worth developing, is how to use these tools really optimally, because they are answer machines, but they're probabilistic answer machines. It's not like you're searching Google and it takes you to Wikipedia and Wikipedia is like dependable. It kind of, as everybody knows, kind of algorithmically predicts what's the next best word for these things. And remarkably produces things that look very intelligent and sometimes are very intelligent, depending on the training data used and whatnot. So all that to say that I think your skill of being skeptical about it and using it in a targeted fashion, as opposed to just accepting everything it spits out as kind of received wisdom, is exactly right. And then the other thing the word you said that I flashed upon, which is again a perfect segue to another skill that I wanted to talk about, discernment. So I've written about this extensively, but I have argued that AI has unleashed what I call a taste economy. And what I mean by taste economy is basically, we're not there yet, but AI has basically given us all access to remarkably intelligent resources. And knowledge, or you might want to call intelligence, is arguably a commodity, and a commodity that's going to zero in terms of value. To some degree. Now, again, this is a bit simplifying things. Obviously, medical knowledge is still prioritized, and legal knowledge is still prioritized, but we can access those things much more cheaply than we used to. ChatGPT is my first order of investigation when I have a little kind of shoulder injury from basketball or something like that. Again, would I let it operate on me? No, but if it's giving me some PT advice, absolutely. So when intelligence is a commodity, what becomes valuable in the marketplace? And I would argue it's taste, or what you called discernment. And I have this very particular definition of taste, which I'd like to share with you if you don't mind. So taste for me is made up of two constituent elements: judgment on the one hand, and what I call craft on the other. And if you think of these things as almost nesting dolls, Russian nesting dolls, those two pillars are also made up of two ideas. So judging for me is values. So your personal values that inform what you decide is important, and preferable. And then the other piece is what I would call analysis. So rigor, knowledge, planning, all those things. All of those things go into judgment. And the combination of those two, values and analysis, form judgment, which is one of the two pillars of taste. And for craft, I talk about this notion of skill. So like an artisan or a craftsman, a craftsperson, build something beautiful or develop something, whether it's code or a piece of furniture. It's carefully and painstakingly put together. So like when you write something as a craftsperson, you write it with love, and you write it with intention, and with a certain amount of flair. And then that's the second piece of craft for me, is what I would call personal aesthetic. So, what is your writing style? I aim for writing pieces where people can kind of hide the name of the author and say, that sounds like a Ian piece, because I'm familiar with his or her style. So taste is judgment plus craft. Judgment is what I call values and analysis, and craft is skill and personal aesthetic. And I think that this is something we all have to develop. We don't have some form of taste, but it's not necessarily educated, and it's not intentionally built. And I think now more than ever, taste will matter. And again, this is true for, within an organization and especially outside of an organization. But your taste will become the differentiator of how you stand out in an organization. In my framework and conception.
Okay, first of all, you did mention Aristotle before we started recording. That is a very Aristotelian, I think,
Yes,
definition of craft.
indeed.
Yeah, no, I recognized aspects of his philosophy. That's very good. Um, I would want to ask you how you would help people develop those 4 pillars, because I think that's one of my I'm not concerned because it sounds really pompous. It's not because we've been doing things for 20, 30 years that we're like really good at it, or like we think that other people can't be doing, well at it because they're using AI to help them do their work. But there's something about having spent that much time honing our craft and our taste and our how do you keep that alive in a time when people become more reliant and in my mind just like skip steps because they're getting extra support, extra scaffolding. Like scaffolding is good when it's done in a way that helps you keep growing and it supports you in a way that that your skills can get stronger. But AI scaffolding in the way that I think, but I don't know really very well how it's being used across organizations. But I'm not sure that the scaffolding is a thoughtful scaffolding. It's it's taking the hard work out. Well, that I see. That's a very judgmental. I'm coming at so I'll ask you the question: how do we help people develop in those 4 pillars?
You nailed the $64 million question. I want to give that perfect analogies at this point. One is I think you have to make a considered effort to reveal tastes on a couple of different levels. So when we talk about values, there are the values that we kind of intrinsically know and pay lip service to, but I think very few people have gone through the exercise of asking, what are my values? And not just, kind of motherhood and apple pie and, that kind of stuff. But if you had to make a hierarchy of values, what would those be? And so I think that's one exercise that I would encourage people to do is, in a sea of multiple choices, what, do I prioritize because of my values? And so what those values are, should be made explicit, both at least in your mind, but maybe even if you're a leader, expressing that to to the people who are on your team. And so I think one is revealing them and exploring them in a philosophical way, perhaps, but also just in a practical way of saying, okay, well, if intention, what's the kind of rank order or stack rank of my priorities, and some of my values, and that's what I would do. For analysis, I think it's kind of straightforward. We can use AI for analysis very well. We need to use it, I think, intentionally, but that's something that I think it's particularly good at, in breaking things down and studying things from a different perspectives and making a straw man or seal man case on certain ideas. In terms of this notion of skill that you're talking about, I think it's particularly relevant at the 2 ends of the spectrum. So people like you and I who've applied our craft, in some cases for many years, if not decades, if we assume that we're still using those skills, then we can rely on obviously the intuitive knowledge that we developed over the years. But I would argue, and we talked about at the top of the podcast, how we're learning new skills. So in many ways, that skill set is still being developed, and still, we don't necessarily have the depth of experience in, say, using these tools or making certain judgments and so on and so forth. So I would say investing in that skill development is particularly important. And the other thing too is, again, under the rubric of revealing things, what is part of your personal aesthetic? Whether it's, you're an interior designer and you have a certain vision, can you articulate it? Can you communicate it? Can you make it consistent? Or are you just kind of well, it feels right, and that's your genius, But if you look at the great artists, Dali and Picasso and others, they had a genius, but they also had a system. They had a very intentional approach. Michelangelo talks about, revealing the art, underneath the marble. He just kind of brought it to light, but it was already there. And I thought that was a beautiful analogy, because I think we need to kind of adopt some of that mentality and be both following our instincts and our intuition, but also getting pretty explicit about what our personal aesthetic is and what those taste drivers are. And I actually have, to carry forward the analogy a little bit, I have kind of 5 flavors of taste, if you don't mind. I can share them with you that, kind of go into this idea of how do you develop taste at any age. So one is curation. What do you curate in terms of what you're presenting to your audience, or visually, or in the courses that you design, for example, what do you exclude and what do you keep in? A second C is conspicuousness. So again, is your taste recognizable? When you read Hemingway, you know right away it's Hemingway because of the short declarative sentences. Whereas if you read Saddam, he spends 5 pages on le genou de cœur. So Saddam style screams out just as Hemingway does. So that's what I aspire to, in that, it should be conspicuous in terms of its clarity to the audience. We talked about craft, which is the third piece. This is a really important one, and it's something that comes into play as we are knowledge brokers and kind of opinion givers. And in some cases, as we go forward with AI will provide us with information, and we will decide what information to kind of communicate, but also to advocate for. And the word I would use is conviction. So a big form of taste is conviction. If you think about it in the finance industry, you could get AI bots to tell you to invest in this stock or that company or in that startup. But humans are persuaded by humans. And so someone who says, look, trust me, you have to invest in NVIDIA in, say, 2015 because AI is about to explode and, they're going to need chips, and NVIDIA is an amazing position for you. That trust me on this, like I'm staking the bank on this. I have enormous 100% conviction to do so. People might have been persuaded. So conviction, I think, is really important. And then lastly, consistency. Taste is expressed in its constant through line, not necessarily in its kind of flashes of brilliance. So when you are demonstrating your taste, you want it to be consistent. You want to show conviction, your craft, your conspicuousness. But the consistency of saying, hey, a Picasso looks like a Picasso, and a Rembrandt has this visual style that is always Rembrandtian. That's what I talk about when I talk about taste. So those are just a couple of ideas about how to, what are the constituent elements, or as I call flavors of taste. And I think in all of those kind of areas, we have work to do in terms of either making those explicit or invest in time in making those much more prevalent parts of our taste.
So thank you for sharing your frameworks, because I think that's really interesting. So it sort of gives a sense of where you're coming from in terms of what you think is important for people to develop. And then I can't help it; my brain right away goes to, practically speaking, how do you do that? So if you're engaged as a coach, can you give me an example of what that might look like if you're bringing somebody along in their development across any of those? You could pick any of those areas.
Sure. So one of the things is you have to be intentional about developing these elements. So and the intentionality starts with, what do you feed your brain and your kind of taste buds with? So if you are exposing yourself to kind of mass media and AI slop, you're not refining your taste. You are basically diluting it. And so when I talk to executives who want to kind of amp up their taste, we almost do like an information diet audit. Say, well, what are the kinds of things you're reading? What are you exposing yourself to? What are your influences? Are you making an effort to kind of draw inspiration from horizontal influences? Or are you just staying in your industry? So I think practically you have to intentionally develop your taste. And the analogy I often use with them is, look, taste grows like weeds. So it could turn out to be like a garden that is a wild meadow, or it could be a manicured, kind of incredibly aesthetically designed, jardin Versailles type vibe. Depends on what you're looking for, but I would militate towards the latter, the kind of aesthetic of Versailles, which is very intentional and very specific. You can quibble with the symmetry and all of that, but the point is that taste will develop entropically. And so you want to be intentional about what goes into those taste elements. And as a result, you then have a better chance of developing the taste that can then be used in these other capacities to inform, the decisions you make. The executives I work with, they express their taste often in the decisions that they make, the resources that they allocate, the strategic directions, that they choose for their organizations or their teams. And so taste is not just, writing a blog post or making painting a picture or designing a room. It's really about what you choose to do. And I would say that with this, there's this kind of, I guess, compendium that goes with it, and that also has kind of been released by AI, and that's agency. So this notion of getting things done, basically. And in Silicon Valley, some of the coaches that I work with are good, balance, and they talked about wanting to hire high agency people. And what they mean by that is people who are, if I can swear on your podcast, get shit done. Like they just say like, okay, we're just going to solve the problem. We're going to hackathon it away. We're going to, we're not going to think about the obstacle. We're just going to think about how we solve these problems. And so what I like to say is, in the AI age, taste decides what you do and agency decides how you do it. And agency has become very important with taste, because now we're at the precipice of having these enormous range of tools that can allow us to do anything. But we don't have the time or the ability to do everything. So we have to choose what to do and how to do it. And so taste and agency go hand in hand in that regard.
Okay, so a few of the things that you've said, that last part about taste and agency and developing those, and also going back to the idea of learning and unlearning. Um, One of the things that I've been focusing on the last few years is looking at the emotional experiences of learning. So aside from all the, the knowledge and skills and stuff, the hardcore stuff that we're trying to develop, there's a lot of emotional, I was going to say wait, that's the wrong word, but as we learn and as we unlearn, actually, that can be an exhilarating experience. It can be scary. It can build our confidence. It can break our confidence down. I think even developing your taste and your agency are very emotionally um,
Thoughts?
driven processes. Yeah. So in your work, do you consider providing support from an emotional perspective to leaders, for example, who are maybe questioning their agency or questioning their taste and trying to figure out how they're going to pivot with people watching them as they're leading their teams? Does that ever come up as an issue?
It's very interesting. So I have an unalloyed positive view towards learning, and I get excited by it. But I probably should recognize that I'm not necessarily in the majority or even representative. I study as a layperson neuroscience as an adjunct to AI, because I feel like those two are kind of blades of the scissors right now. And one of the things that I'm known for is like the answer to all of the questions is dopamine. And I can go on a whole riff on that. But basically, we get bursts of dopamine when we learn things, or when we're just about to look at something revealed that's novel. So, in fact, a lot of applications, whether it's Duolingo in the literal sense, and the infinite scroll of Instagram in the more pernicious sense, those applications and those media companies basically hack that physiological joy that you get out of. So I come at it from that angle. But in answer to your question about executives, absolutely that, I think you were kind of almost asking about mindsets, because mindsets for me are a way to manage emotional states. And I think that is a tremendously important piece to the overall picture. And a lot of the times that I work with executives, it's not that they can't learn. It's really that they have to accept that there's this inflection point in their careers, and that they have to embrace it. And they're not always, so the number one thing that I look for in a client is if they're coachable. Do they want to cook? And presumably they are, because they're looking for coaches. They come to me to be their coach. But it's not obvious that they are coaching. That does not follow, as the sun rises or the sun sets. And so that mindset, actually being coachable, actually being emotionally ready, to use your terminology, to update their operating systems, if you will, is not always the case. But I usually get them there if they're open enough to embrace that through a combination of, some of persuasion, a little bit of, fear mongering, if you will, to kind of let them know that this is important for their careers and their continued viability. And I can, if you want to transition to the idea of mindsets now, because I've never been wanting to talk about that, I could also talk a little bit about the mindsets that I think are really important for your listeners to adopt in this particular moment.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear about that because just to say that I think we come at this from a slightly different perspective because most typically I'm imagining people come to you, that's what you're saying, to receive coaching. Still doesn't mean they're necessarily coachable, but they've deliberately come to you for that. Whereas most of my experience is developing training programs that people either just get assigned to because they're in a role in the organization, so they have to go. Or what's even worse, kind of sometimes, is people end up in classes that they don't think they need. But if you look back at whatever 360-degree assessment was done on their skills, and maybe it's coaching, for example, I've literally been in a room with people who were in for a coaching 2-day coaching program, and one turned to the other and said, "I've been coaching people for like 14 years. I've been leading a team. I don't need to be here. I don't even understand why I'm here." And I actually knew that everybody in the room had gotten like pretty low ratings. But they weren't even able to really say it to themselves. They had to kind of posture and say, "I don't even really need to be here." And so, being able to face the fact like that, they're not necessarily motivated. They may or may not be confident in their ability to learn those new skills. They might not even be aware that they need to. So that's, I think, why I eventually started looking more and more at the emotional state, maybe the mindset. So I would love to hear more about mindset from you.
Sure. So you're also kind of triggering me a little bit in the sense that I've given workshops too, and there is always a resistance that you have to break through. Often when it's kind of corporate training programs that have been imposed upon them, and that they're not necessarily happy to be there. And so what I try to do is combination of kind of fear and encouragement. And sometimes I need to start with fear in the sense of kind of shocking the system a little bit. And I'll paint a picture that is not dystopian by any stretch of the imagination, but it's kind of real talk about where, what we're facing right now, the challenges that, your company is facing, that you personally may be facing, and that the society is facing. And this is for real. And I go through, I try to make a kind of a fact-based argument, but I use the facts in a literal sense to kind of provoke some measured form of fear. Because I think that you have to grab their attention in order to kind of shake them out of this stasis that they found themselves in, or this resistance to like, well, why am I even paying attention to this particular presentation or workshop? So for me, that's really important. And I sometimes, like for example, when I teach executives about AI, I lay out the fact that I am totally AI pilled. So by that I mean that I'm a believer. I think this is a epoch defining technology, and that will transform entire industries and societies quicker than we realize. Probably not as quickly as the optimists say, but not as slowly as the pessimists and the kind of doubters hope is the case. You mentioned at the early part of the call that you had hoped to kind of outrun AI, and I often talk to executives about this, and I say, look, you can't run out the clock, to use a sports analogy, on AI. Like, it's here, it's changing your industry already. You may not be aware of it, but it is. And so the time to have run out the clock was like 5 years ago. Now you just have to kind of embrace it. So coming back to this idea of mindsets, and maybe we'll start with the emotional kind of angle that you were saying. I prefer to try to instill a form of excitement rather than anxiety about these challenges. They're challenges, yes, you can't diminish them, but I find that we fear the future only when we try to resist it. So, if you are trying to run out the clock, if you're trying to squeeze out those last couple of years before retirement and not, interface with AI, my personal opinion is that you can't, and why should you? Why not embrace this technology and these tools and these capabilities? And so, for me, it's about embracing this moment that we live in, and I take a posture of positivity.